I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Reading Museum, and we're interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC opening its first office in the UK. It's July the 20th, and we are in National Museum of Computing. I'm here today talking to Tom Povey. Tom, please, let's start with the basics. If you could please just tell me your full name and your place and your year of birth.
Right, my full name is Thomas Francis Povey, and I was born in Boston, Lincolnshire, in 1952.
And what was your kind of early life and who were your parents?
I was an only child. I didn't get a lot of interaction with my father. I got pushed into the grammar school a year early, so I struggled academically. Ended up doing 3 years in the sixth form. Went to Plymouth Polytechnic, because it was the furthest away from Boston I could get. Discovered computers. It was a 3-part degree course: maths, statistics and computing. So I wrote my first program on a PDP. I had no idea what PDP was, or I never heard of digital. But when I discovered computing, I thought that it's better to have a degree in computing than a degree in mathematics. I might get a better job. So I went up to London and taught my way into Brunel University. I did a computer science degree from 72 to 76, which included 3 industrial placements, but 2 with Burroughs Corporation. And then I moved to Scotland with them, relocated to Scotland with them. And then the thing that got me into DEC indirectly is that I was in the office one day, and one of my colleagues was on a number of standards committees. Like in the 80s, were very big on standards. And he got an invite to another standards group. And he always said, I don't want to do another one. And I said, oh, what is it? And he said, oh, it's a screen management task group. Oh, I said, I built a screen management package when I was in London with Burroughs. I'm happy to go. So I went to the first meeting, which was in Boston, Massachusetts, and met a guy, Dan France, from DEC. And we just gelled, and we had the same ideas about what screen management ought to be. And he said, this is the short story, he said, well, join DEC in Reading and I'll get you over to Massachusetts when I start the project. So I applied. DEC were advertising for more engineers for all-in-one version 2. So I applied and got accepted, joined the group. And then by 85, Dan had managed to start the project. And in 86, I relocated to the States.
Okay, just so go back a little bit there. So
Yeah.
you kind of didn't have, what were your kind of interests at school? Did you have like a technical kind of interest, or because computers and
Mathematics.
maths were
I was good at mathematics, and I enjoyed sport. Spent a lot of time in the gym. Learned how to play a number of card games and backgammon. So I wasn't very academic, to be honest. It wasn't until much later that I became more academic. Really with Burroughs, thinking about it.
So then you discovered computing.
Yeah.
What when we say computing as period, and you used a PDP-8, I think you said.
Yeah, well, in those days, you would write on a coding sheet, and you would give it to a typist to generate punch cards. Take the deck of punch cards to a card reader. That would get read into the computer. It would run the program, and then it would you'd get your results on a line printer. One of my early programs was to find the longest palindrome, which is a fairly easy thing to do on a computer. But I think, now where was I when I did that? No, it was when I got to Brunel. I was doing a program that was too big for the ICL 1900 to run. And so I took a box of DEC cards up to Imperial College and got them to run it.
And that's interesting. So that was that your kind of first experience of DEC, doing that?
No, I didn't discover DEC until 81 when I met Dan on the standards committee. And I still didn't know. I didn't know much about DEC until I joined them in 83. Yeah, my first day at DEC was the 1st of December, so it's 1 DEC 83.
So you went from Burroughs to DEC.
Yeah.
And you had no idea who DEC were, and hadn't
Not
even
really.
heard about them. No
Well,
company.
I'd heard from Dan that they were a good company to work for.
Mm.
I'd heard about networking. The month before I moved to join DEC, I sent my first email in Boroughs. I can't remember who to, but I just remember sitting there in front of this terminal had appeared in the factory, and I got on it and sent an email to somebody. And then when I arrived at DEC and sat down at my desk, there was a terminal there, VT100, and I had an account, so I log in, and there's an email waiting for me from Dan. That was quite a nice welcome, given that Dan was in Massachusetts and I was in Reading.
I mean, how unusual was it to have was email wasn't particularly widely used at this point,
No,
was it?
not at all. Not at all. And I had no feel for it at the time.
Mm.
But I very quickly got used to the DEC culture. One of the main things that strikes me that I want to record at some point is that when I joined DEC, I joined Central Engineering, which was its own culture, and there were around 60,000 people in the company worldwide. And by 1990, there were 120,000. So it doubled in size. Those rough numbers, it doubled in size. And it just totally diluted the culture.
Well, if you stop there for a second, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
What do you think? So tell me about why is DEC involved in standards work? What are standards? And you said you went to do there was something with screen management. What?
Okay, I think it probably goes back to the 60s. The first standards body I'm aware of was for the computer language called COBOL, Common Business Orientated Language, and because users didn't want to be tied into a manufacturer. Because in the early days of computers, you bought the hardware and you bought the software from the manufacturer, and that tied you in when you started writing programs for your own business. And so users decided there ought to be, I think it was the US military possibly that started it, or US government that started it. There should be standards across the computer manufacturers. So at one point I was on the COBOL standards group, but the COBOL standards group, the people on the group were trying to agree how the COBOL language should evolve to support these new things coming in called screens. Because it was developed for input from card readers, output to line printers. But there were these screens now. How would you organise what you would display on a screen for people to type in? And there were a number of competing ideas about how to do it. So the COBOL committee set up a screen management task group and tasked them with the job of coming up with a recommendation. And so I joined them. If you want to talk about standards for a minute, I joined them end of 80, I think. I was on the standards group until I moved to DEC, and I was vice chairman at one point because the chairman didn't want to always come to a meeting. But there were really two schools of thought. There was, let's just put extra commands into COBOL to manage screens. That was one. Data General and one or two others wanted to do that. And then there was what became DEC Forms, the idea of let's separate it out and have something that works with not just with COBOL, but with any language. And that's what Dan and I agreed on.
So how important were standards, especially was DEC's involvement in standards work?
Very important, because arguably that's one of the downfalls of DEC, because they were very supportive of standards. As was said earlier on today, DEC listened to its users very, very closely. And DECUS was a great organisation. So DEC was very supportive of standards and put a lot of reps on standards committees. And one of the big ones was OSI, Open Systems Interconnection. And when I came back from DEC, I joined the networking group. And of course that went nowhere. They were trying to build software to a standard, but nobody wanted it because the industry had changed and there's more open source stuff. coming around.
So DEC was very active in standards.
Very active in standards, yeah.
Especially during the early days of the 70s, the 80s.
Yeah, definitely.
So what was so Dan convinces you? What was it Dan actually said to persuade you? Considering you probably sound like you were happily employed at Burroughs, and you were not looking. You had no idea what DEC was.
There's hardly ever a simple answer to changes. I saw the writing on the wall for Burroughs, and a few years after I left, they closed the factory down. So
what were Burroughs doing?
Right, Burroughs were one of the early computer hardware manufacturers like IBM and Univac and Honeywell. They built business machines, and they built large machines in the States, and they built the small business machines in Cumbernauld in Scotland. And so it was a factory with a tower block in the middle, and the top 2 floors of the tower block was where the software engineers sat, and they wrote the operating system and the language compilers for the small business machines.
So you could see what was wrong with Burroughs, where was it going, and just...
It wasn't, the industry was changing. Burroughs, to my mind, is having done a degree in computer science and looked at the history of computing. In software terms, they were very innovative, particularly compared to IBM, because Burroughs had a rule that you must always compile a program from source code. Whereas a lot of people, particularly IBM programmers, it compiled from source code, then they patch the assembly, the machine code. And then you lost track of what the program actually did. Whereas Burroughs, the rule was you must always compile from source code. And then they introduced a virtual machine on the 1700, which was the second. The Elliott 803 was the first one, and the Burroughs B1700 was the second one that had a virtual machine. Was losing track from DEC, but...
So tell me, DEC, so Tom says, so you kind of can see the writing on the wall for Burroughs, and what does Tom say? You're not actually looking for a job, but Tom says something that gets you...
Dan.
Dan says...
Yeah. No, it was really because we gelled over screen management, and how screen management should be done. In the standards group, there were these 2 camps, and as I say, I took over as vice chair, so I'd run the meetings, and I actually got the 2 camps to write a proposal, and then we all voted on it. And I can't remember the outcome, but it didn't really go anywhere, I don't think. No, hang on, it did, because then, that's right, then it went from a Codicil COBOL committee task group to being a Codicil standards committee. So it went up a level in the standards hierarchy, and it was called the Forms Interface Management System. And Dan carried on working on that.
But Dan managed to get you interested enough.
That got me interested enough. I could see Burroughs wasn't sure where Burroughs were going. Really interested in the idea of screen management, because I'd already done something in the late 70s on Burroughs kit. And so I thought, that would be a good thing to do. And so Burroughs DEC were advertising in Reading, so I applied for a job, and they accepted me.
Do you remember anything about the interview process? How did that go?
Good question. I came down and they put me up in a hotel in Pangbourne and let me hire a car. But I can't remember anything about the actual interview process. I'll tell you one thing about it, and that is I was going to have to resign from the Standards Committee. So there was a Standards meeting in the middle of November, and I was going to join DEC. No, was it November? No, I think it was the middle of October. Anyway, prior to me joining DEC, there's a Standards meeting I wanted Burroughs to send me to. So I told the people in DEC, I said, just don't write to Burroughs yet. Let me do the Standards meeting and then write to them. And of course they didn't. They wrote to Burroughs. But because I was going to somewhere in the States, I flew out on the Friday. So I was actually at the airport when they contacted my wife to say, where is he? He's going to leave Boroughs, and she said, oh, well, he's on his way to a standards meeting. And of course, in those days, no mobile phone. They couldn't get hold of me. So I got my standards meeting in and then got a little bit told off when I got back. But yeah, so be it.
And what was interesting here, like say your first day at DEC, you had the email welcoming you.
Yeah.
What's DEC like compared to Burroughs? First impressions?
Burroughs was a factory with a tower block with 2 floors of software engineers in it. DEC was just open, and it was open. It was open plan. So it was DEC Part 1 to start with, and they were still building DEC Part 2, and so it was just welcoming. It was the people had been tasked with developing all-in-one version 2, which is why I joined. And there was just excitement about it. Whereas I've been working for boroughs that have been around for decades, and there wasn't any excitement there.
And do you think that came from, where do you think all the roots of that excitement? Was it kind of the people making the place, the work? And
No, in those days, I think it all came from the origins of DEC. DEC started out with the idea of mini computers, when the other idea from the likes of IBM, Burroughs, Univac, Honeywell was big computers in big machine rooms and people in white coats. So there was just excitement about doing things differently, and that's something that excited me.
And what was DEC Park? You started DEC Park 1. Describe the inside. What it look like?
What I learned today, which I never knew before, is that the building, which is DEC Part 1, was built by Reading Council as a shell for a factory. And then DEC found it and bought it, and they fitted it out inside. So they fitted 2 floors on one side, a walkway down. It's probably 2/3 and a third, and a walkway down the middle. Mm-hmm. Did you ever go to DEC Part 1? No. A walkway down the middle. There was a main entrance and a canteen, restaurant, canteen, whatever you want to call it. And then on the one side of the walkway, it was single story, and there was distribution stuff behind a behind a partition. And then a few desks in front of that, which are temporary desks for people who are going to move into DEC Part 2, but it wasn't built yet, which is where I went into.
And we hear a lot about this walkway down the middle, it's called the street, I think, the green carpet.
That's right, the street, yeah, the street.
What was there, it must have been quite a social atmosphere, sounds like people could hang out quite a lot. Did you feel that?
Another thing about DEC is people were encouraged to hang out. The number of ideas that came up over a coffee machine when people were talking was phenomenal. The other people story about the street is that at some point after I joined, I can't remember exactly when, the ladies complained that the gentlemen walking on the street would look up and be looking up their skirts, and so they had to put some sort of shield along the walkway, along the upstairs walkway.
What was the idea? Was you get a chance to try the canteen food, or what was the kind
I just remember it being great. Yeah, that's all I can remember. It being great. The employee entrance, the main entrance at the front. The employee entrance was at the back, which became halfway between DEC Part 1 and DEC Part 2. And you got to know the doorman. And I remember him telling me that Ken Olsen came to visit. And if my memory is correct, he said Ken's badge number was 3, not 1. And I think I read that somewhere. When they started the company, he didn't want his badge number to be 1. He gave it to somebody who was important in helping start the company off. But do people talk to you about badge numbers? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 180083, it's still there.
It's interesting. We get a lot of comments about badges, and we have a pile of badges as well. So badge numbers are really important. You kind of came to identify yourself by your badge.
Yeah. You used it a lot. You had to use it. Unfortunately, I've lost mine You're supposed to hand it in when you leave, but because of my relocation, I know I kept it, but I can't find it. It's a shame.
Any other kind of memories of Deck Park 1 or 2?
Oh, well, Dead Part 2, because I was there when it's set up, and somebody gave me the job of deciding which cubes people are in. Because I know Peter Thompson, I think it was him, talked about Deck Park being all open plan, and indeed it was. The partitions were just below eye level, so you could see people. But Deck Part 2 was an engineering building, so the partitions were, head height, above head height. And in the first time, the cubes had room for L-shaped working desk and then a small round table. So you could have a meeting in your cube. And that really encouraged people to work together, although clearly there's a lot of electronic communication. And oftentimes you'd send somebody a message, a text message, rather than actually go around and speak to them, unless you wanted a longer conversation. Although the text message might be, is it time to go to the pub yet?
That's a good question. It leads into, what was the workplace like? I mean, was it kind of informal, flexible? Was there a sense of fun, or was it relaxed? Or was it very hard working?
It varied. There were people that took advantage of the flexibility and didn't work very hard. There was one guy on a Friday who would always come back drunk and just sit in his cube. Won't mention any names. I can't remember his name anyway. But no, there's a lot of hard work done, a lot of very inventive work done around. So there's only all-in-one in those days. Have you come across John Brooke?
Don't think so.
John created what was it called? The User Interface Lab, where they did user testing of all-in-one. And he appeared on Facebook the other day because he's written a book about it, and the things they created in the User Interface Lab have gone out into other places. So I'll send you a link on that. But there was a User Interface Lab, which basically was a one-way screen where they'd sit somebody in front of a terminal and they'd put them on TV to record it, and they'd watch them, just how they interacted with the software.
Was anybody else doing this kind of thing in the industry, do you think?
I don't believe so. Not from what I read. Yeah. Oh, DEC was very innovative. And one of the things about the layout of DEC Part 2 was to make sure there was enough space around the coffee machines for people to chat.
These are the coffee machines, what, in the because they're along the street as well, so you're actually like Deck Part 2 here, where there was more.
Yeah, I don't remember along the street, but Deck Part 2, there would be blocks of cubes, and then the centre of it was the machine room, and then between the cubes, 1 or 2 intervals, there'd be an area with a coffee machine and hot water if you wanted tea.
So did people really try and take advantage of these areas? Were they good kind of like?
Some did.
What was the purpose of them, and what did that kind of result?
The purpose, I have to be careful here because I worked in the States for 4 years, and that was the high spot, the concentration of my time with DEC, and so I've got to be careful I don't mix up what I got from those years and what I got in Reading. But the idea was of the coffee stations was to give people time to chat. And some people wouldn't. Not everybody is a natural communicator or wants to talk to other people about what they are doing. But and there were lots of meeting rooms, different sizes as well. I can't remember there being a big meeting room in DEC Part 2. But there were certainly quite a few small meeting rooms that you could use.
And you were working on all-in-one, I think, initially. You said,
that's right. Yeah, I joined to do all-in-one version 2.
So what was it? That was quite significant because the work has shifted on all-in-one here to the UK at this point, hasn't it?
Yeah, all-in-one started out. It got the name the Charlotte package because it started in a DEC office in Charlotte, North Carolina, for a big company in the States on the East Coast. whose name I can't remember, but they basically bought DEC kit and they wanted an electronic office system. So the guys in Charlotte built them one, and then management, DEC, commercial management wanted a product. The engineers in the States, in Spitbrook, in Nashua, didn't want to do it because it wasn't the right thing for them to do because it was commercial. So they pushed it on to the engineers in Reading. And so Reading inherited this and had to employ a lot more software engineers to work on it. So it was supposed to be built. Okay, customers were told, we've got this package and they said, we're going to call it all-in-one and you can buy it. But it wasn't actually there yet. And so there was a lot of pressure on the all-in-one group to produce it. And from memory, it took a good 1.5 to 2 years before it was actually released. And my personal story is, with a colleague, I was asked to build a short-term fix to connect two all-in-one systems together. And so we built it, and it sat on the shelf until all-in-one version 2 was released. I go to the States, I come back, so we're talking 8 years after we built a short-term fix. There was a presentation from a customer, and it was their favourite feature in the product. But that's kind of what DEC was all about. You know, it wasn't a question of, well, in engineering in the States, it was more a question of we know best. But DEC as a whole, they would listen to customers and then give a customer what worked for the customer, and then sell it to other customers.
Because this is I think your work here now as part of the central engineering group, is that correct?
Yeah.
Which is a very distinct part of DEC, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it was. Yeah.
How do you describe its role and what it actually did?
Its role was to produce initially the important language product, the operating system and the language products. That's where VMS came from. That's where all the language compilers came from.
We say languages for computer language or spoken?
Yeah, computer, all computer language. So Fortran, COBOL, BASIC, and whatever else there was in those days, Algol. So they'd build those essential products. And then they started to branch out into other products like database products, RDB, relational database, data tree was mentioned earlier. They all came out of software engineers having time to have good ideas and build software and then see whether they would sell or not.
Now, you described something called midnight projects?
Yeah.
Now, what were midnight projects? And you had an example of one as well, I think.
The idea was engineers kind of work 9 to 5, but they have to work on what they're told to work on. But if an engineer had an idea, they could work on it in their own time. And so they were called midnight projects. You might work on it past midnight, whether you're in the office or working at home. And so one midnight project was something that was called phone originally. Nothing to do with talk. It was basically text messaging between VAXes. And the guy who built it was Ben Schreiber, and he just called it phone. And then it got called something else. And when I was talking to somebody, neither of us could remember what it got called. But it's basically SMS, what we now know as SMS. But the other one is what became DEC Notes, which later moved on to Lotus Notes. But the actual details of that move I'm not very clear on. But I do know that Ben wrote VAX Notes. No, I think he wrote PDP Notes to start with. Then he migrated it to the VAX as VAX Notes. And then it became productized as DEC Notes. And by the time I went to the States, or at least by 87, 88, the company, to some extent, was run on DEC Notes.
And what was DEC Notes?
It was like a bulletin board. But it's a bulletin board where the people, it was a distributed bulletin board in the sense that DEC Notes, how can I describe DEC Notes? Well, it's a bit like today's World Wide Web, really, because if I use the analogy of the World Wide Web, you can build a web server and then you can put a website on top of the server. Well, that would be DEC Notes server, I suppose, and then the people that own it, like people that build a website, own it. They can put information up. The people that own the DEC Notes conference, that's what it's called, the conference, DEC Notes conference, they would create it and they'd put information up, and then people could ask questions about it. And so it became interactive. So when we launched DEC Forms, we had 3 or 4 notes files. We had one where we would announce things. We had one problem solving. So somebody else would post, I've got this problem. And as engineering, we'd respond to them. And it was that connection that people talked about this morning between the engineering groups and the customers. Now, not every engineering group worked that way, but yeah, I mean, I could talk more about DEC Forms, but that's not really related to Reading.
It doesn't matter, it's just fine. So DEC Notes and DEC Forms, DEC Notes came out of the Midnight Project.
Yeah, it started out as a Midnight Project.
Yeah.
It became, through 2 or 3 evolutions, it became productized as DEC Notes. Mm. And that's like a bulletin board, like a website. DEC Forms is different because DEC Forms was a software suite that allowed you to build electronic forms that were quite sophisticated, like you see on the web now. And that was a product development that started in 85 and released in 89. And I joined the group and became project leader, and then the group got too big for me to manage, and so we changed the structure, and I led with a product manager, I led the launch of it. And just as an example of how DEC encouraged engineers to relate to customers, I went to a DECUS in Boston, and I happened to be stood behind 2 people chatting about how hard it was to learn how to use DEC software products, because DEC just gave you the product, gave you a manual, let you get on with it. And so I went back, and as part of launching DEC Forms product, we built a demo package. And so it had an example of how to use the product from every language that VMS supported, and the form that you would build demonstrated what you could do with DEC Forms. And DEC Forms became the fastest selling layered product that DEC ever had.
So layered product?
A layered product is software that's layered on top of the hardware. So languages were, let's start again. No, they classify differently. I think Fortran's the biggest selling compiler, the biggest selling software product, as I remember. But other than language products, other products like relational database, like DataTree, like the transaction monitor and DEC Forms, they're called layered products. And I've got a certificate back home that says DEC was the fastest selling layered product.
And layered means it comes on the hardware.
It comes layered on the hardware, but above the languages is the way they thought of it in those days.
Right. So like an application.
An application, yeah. Well, it's an application builder, really. That's what you'd probably call it these days. I'm trying to think what there is equivalent these days. Funnily enough, after leaving DEC, I hopped between various startups and places. Ended up with a company that had invented a product that was so like DEC Forms, was amazing, but they'd invented it totally independently. Anyway.
So how much of all this work is kind of going place in Central Engineering Group? Was this these are all kind of CEG projects, or all of these, or any of these, or none of these?
All of these, yeah. Really, other than my last year at DEC, all my experience was within Central Engineering.
And how big, I suppose, or important did it become? It's based in Reading,
No, cell engineering was based in the States.
but the people working there are, his team is working in Reading, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. So there was the Reading team was all in one, and then a networking group that were working on developing products around the OSI standard, or the proposed OSI standard.
But the software, the people working on software, just working on all-in-one, or are they working on deck notes and deck forms
No,
as well?
that's all in the States.
That's all the States.
Yeah.
So the all-in-one groups, how big does the all-in-one work become? I guess, does it pick up a momentum in terms of, do you see it growing in size and importance?
Yeah. It grew because I left in '86, and that was round about when 85, 86 when all-in-one version 2 was released, I think, and then it took off. And talking to some people, somebody reckons that I spoke to reckoned all-in-one was responsible for around 10% of DEC's revenue at one point, because people wanted to buy an electronic office system, and so that led to them buying Vaxes to run it on.
What were the uses? What was it? Today we have, Office 365 now is fairly commonplace in collaboration, where it's important. What was all-in-one achieving that was kind of different for the
It was
time?
an early version of Office 365, really. If you picture an office not having a PC, not having the internet, but having a terminal where you could have a calendar, you could have you have personal calendar, access to other people's calendar, group calendar, you could have email, you had access to a bulletin board, which called DEC had a product called Video Text, VTX, and so you have access to that. But a big thing about all-in-one is it had its own development language. So as a customer, you could develop additional applications that fit in with it. Or you'd obviously have mail in there as well.
And Reading's role, your role, is to develop the features, because it's the
And
battle.
turn it into a supportable product.
And can you think of any kind of particular work you did there? Anything stand out that you contributed?
Well, there's
to?
the networking thing I did with Dave Shove, the bit that we put on the shelf, and then it was still there eight years later. The other bit I'm most impressed by, and I can't remember the names of the people involved, but all-in-one, what you see today, you get a software product release, it's version 1, and then they want to bring out version 1.1, and then eventually version 2. Thing about all-in-one is you release it to a customer and you expect the customer to customize it. So they provided quite easily the hooks so people could customize it. Then what happens when you want to release a new version of the core software? So they developed some very clever tools whereby the installation of the new software would look and see what had been customized and knit it together. And that was done while I was in the States. And so I only found out about it when I came back. But that was really clever, really clever.
And obviously it's becoming a huge part of the business. Do you think any kind of sense of the customers you were working with? Did you get an insight into the customers who are using all-in-one?
Not really, because I say it was released when I was in the States. I mean, if you do talk to Lynn Canal, I think she was product manager for a year, and she probably has more contact with customers. And you must have talked to Ian Seven. I mean, he was very much around all-in-one, and I'm sure he can tell you a lot more about its impact on customers. I just know the other person, Alf Pilgrim, if you haven't come across him, he joined a day or two before I did, and he ended up as all-in-one engineering manager. And when I came back from the States, and I just remember the enthusiasm from customers, because I was involved in. He got me to sit in on one or two meetings with customers, and just the enthusiasm that they had for the product.
Why was it transforming their lives, their work?
Yeah. It was allowing them to do things they couldn't otherwise do. And there's something about electronic communication that catches people. It doesn't catch everybody in the same way by any means. And no doubt the people that were captured by all-in-one were the early adopter type people, but they were very enthusiastic about it.
Well, let's talk about something else, because you were involved in, because you had your role, your work was clearly defined there, but also you created something called the Vogue on News as well, didn't you?
Yes.
So what is Vogue on News?
Okay.
And how did it come about?
It came about because there's a lot of relocation of engineers, and so there's some engineers from Reading that went over to the States in about 83, 4, 5. I can't really remember the exact year. Let's get this right, because you can edit this out, can't you? Okay, they relocated in 80/81, and basically one of the engineers who had gone to the States was in touch through email with a colleague in England, and he said, "Yeah, tell me what's going on. I can't find out what's going on back in England." So Richard de Morgan is the guy in Reading, and he basically sent an email to his friend, and then he did another one. Then he did another one, and at some point, because like DEC, every user had an account on a VAX, and the VAX were clustered, and the clusters would have 5 or 6 nodes in them, and each one would have a name. And in engineering, the group that were given a cluster could name their nodes. It was normally by theme. And so we're talking about the early 80s, and the theme was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So there was a number of, there was a 42, F-O-R-T-Y, because names had to be 6 characters or less. There was a 42, and there was a Marvin, and there was a Vogon. And Richard's account was on Vogon. And so after sending a few emails across, he titled his email the Vogon News. Anyway, the guys in the States that were getting it, they liked it. They'd forward it to some of their friends, and then Richard started a distribution list, and I think after a few months it was going to he was emailing news to 30 people, and it gradually grew. So when I went to the States in 1986, I heard about it, and so I got on the distribution list. And so every morning when I get into work, the States being 5 hours behind England, like the first thing I could do was read the English news, which when you're cut off from your home country, that had quite an impact.
How long was you travelling then? Did you do a lot of travel for all-in-one?
For all-in-one, very little. I went to Charlotte, met the people that originally built it, and I went to they had something going on in Merrimack. I went there, and I went to Deckville as part of showing what was coming, but that was it, really.
But you sense the sense of the Vogon News is good for people like you who would have been travelling and like relocating.
It's really, if you're in the States. Well, so when I was in the States, you've got so little news of England, because the newspaper, the States, like you know, is big, right? And there's so much goes on. So you buy the Boston Globe, and it's all full of adverts and Boston news and a little bit of national news. My best example is when the hurricane hit in 88, I think it was. There was a little thing, well, the big news in the States was a boy was trapped down a well in Texas, and Nancy Reagan was having an operation on her breast. And that was the big news in the States. If you go through the Boston Globe, there's a small paragraph that said that there had been a hurricane in England and Sevenoaks no longer had Sevenoaks. And that was it. So to get this daily update of what's going on, as well as the cricket scores, was quite something.
So somebody actually writing the news?
Yeah.
Was that you? Or
Richard. No, well,
Richard?
in the early days it was Richard, and then Richard left, and somebody I can't remember. I could look it up. Took it over. When I moved back in 1990, that guy wanted to stop, and so I volunteered to take it over. So I was the news editor for 3 years.
And
so
you're actually writing the materials?
Yeah, 7 o'clock in the morning, I listened to the BBC News, and I would sketch out the keywords, and then I'd go back and flesh it out. And then the important guy, other than Richard, who actually started it, the most important guy is Marios Cleoverlou, because he automated it. And so you're talking about 80, when did he automate it? In the late 80s, he automated it, so that by then it had a main news, had a computer news, had technology news, had a sports news, all different people contributing. And you'd send your contribution in by email, and then the automated system would put it all together and then send it out. And so I could write anything that would go to 8,000 people with nobody in the way.
So it's an unusual time, isn't it? Because today you could easily get their information from anywhere.
Absolutely.
Online, and
Absolutely.
you can stream your news service from anything you want.
That's
really,
right.
you
That's
know.
right. But Vogon News declined in the early 80s as the web came up, because people and the internet came up. So there was no longer need for it. But it wasn't just in DEC. It was people in DEC would send it out to other places as well, even as the internet was starting to grow.
And did you have any sense of what kind of stories? Would it be all news or all sport, or was it anything in particular you emphasised over other stories?
No, it was whatever was the news. What I did was whatever was the news headlines of the day. Yeah, I did do a couple of April Fool jokes, but other than that, it was whatever the BBC put out as the headlines of the day.
And what was the kind of response? Did you get feedback from people?
Yeah, there were letters to the editor. Oh, there's Vogon balls. You remember David Coleman? And there was a thing called Coleman balls in Private Eye. Well, we had a Vogon balls as well. But this was all in the day. If you were abroad, you could get very little English news. This was a way of doing it. As I say, there were 8,000 at its heyday. There were about 8,000 direct subscribers. But what Marios did with the technology, not only did he automate the production of it, there was another product in DEC that probably came from Midnight Project called Nmail, and basically it allowed you to send mail to one node and then it would distribute out to more, and so you didn't have 8,000 emails going from one place. It would be decentralized.
Do you think, I mean, there's a sense here of DEC kind of practicing what it preaches, isn't there, in terms of content and network delivery?
Yeah.
Was it ever seen in those kind of terms, or was it always just a kind of a light-hearted kind of service?
I think it only meant something to the people that it meant something to, if you see what I mean. Like me, because I've been on relocation. And, I could read it, take it home and tell my wife what was going on. And other than that, you're totally... There are lots of benefits of being on relocation. You learn a lot about different cultures and that. But to keep in touch with home, that was quite special.
And what was the feedback you got from your letters to the editor? Any specific feedback from the day or overall about the value?
Some of the specific feedback would be on a point about something that had been said. But I can't remember. I've got a small database of Vogon News that I got from Marios before he left. And I don't know whether you've looked at the website that I built. That's got the basic outline of the history and a few sample issues.
I'm just kind of curious, did you get any sense of, I guess the question is like, what value did people communicate to you it had to them? Did it say, yes, I felt connected to the UK in any way, or anything else benefits they derived from this?
I've met one or two people that remember it fondly on that basis. But to my mind, human nature is such that you get more complaints than you get praise. So just by virtue of the fact that 8,000 people signed up for it, it had around 4,000 hits on VTX. The fact that so many people used it, I think, just says something for itself.
And were they all? Was it all UK people who would
No.
read it? Was it?
No. I think non-English people got into reading it because it would have computer news and technology news, and they were done by two guys in the States, and so it was a way of keeping up to date what's going on in the industry, what's going on with technology. So I think that drew a lot of people in.
And so I suppose what was is an interesting kind of comment, I suppose, on the working culture there at DEC. How would you describe the workplace culture, the working environment? We hear a lot about the sense of it was very collegiate and everyone was great peers and it was a good environment to work on. What was your perspective on that? What was it like to actually to work there? The work was the work, but what was the kind of social environment like, the human environment?
It was good. You were encouraged to have what DEC called woods meetings.
What's
so
that?
Once Massachusetts nowadays it's a big forest, and and particularly in New Hampshire, where the Central Engineering Group were, and they encouraged off-site meetings for groups to go off-site once a year. And I remember we went to a ski resort in the summer, and it was called a woods meeting. And I think Ken would take his senior managers out to somewhere and to talk about strategy or whatever. And they just called it a woods meeting. And so that gave the employees in a group the opportunity to sort of gel in a social environment. And then you'd have some work meetings while you're there as well.
And did you? I mean, you'd have been based in the UK, but yes, you would have gone over to the US for the woods meetings or the wood meetings.
No. Woods meetings is for a small group. So they work together.
You practiced them here in the UK.
I never knew them working in the UK, and maybe that's a bit of a difference between the UK culture and the American culture. Because as soon as I went over there in August '86, and went to my first woods meeting a month or two later, when I had to present to the team who I hadn't met, other than Dan, I hadn't met before.
Why were you? So you went to the US for what reason? Was it for training or was it?
For DEC forms.
So it was for DEC forms, sorry.
In '86, yeah.
Right. And what was it? Did you notice a difference in other ways? So the culture, maybe the culture was different between DEC UK and DEC US. Could you describe it in any kind of way?
It was much freer in the States, in some ways. But in other ways, people, as a generality, weren't as prepared to step outside the box as they were in the UK, I think. We heard this morning about various projects that were done in the UK that were done by users or users with DEC, and that might happen. Once I got to the States, I was within the closed environment of central engineering. And so, and I remember they were very resistant to other people's ideas, which is, again, I think it led a bit to the downfall of DEC.
That kind of seems at odds with what we usually hear about DEC, this kind of group being like this. I mean, can you explain that or describe that?
Again, DEC was a company with lots of different sides to it. And I think what I'm thinking of is purely central engineering. And I think the people and the egos within central engineering were such that they felt they knew best. And I know there was, by '89, there was problems because DEC salesmen, marketing people, were doing things with Microsoft rather than central engineering. Because central engineering weren't listening to customers, and they weren't, other than DEC forms, they weren't listening to customers. And but Microsoft were. They were producing what customers wanted.
And you described at the start, you just talked about the growth of central engineering. I think you said there was several thousand there by the time you
No,
joined, and it grew
I
to.
was talking about the whole company.
Sorry, I thought you meant.
Yeah, no, so yeah, it's good to clarify. The whole company when I joined was around 60,000,
Yeah.
as I remember it. And then by 1990, it was more like 120,000.
Now you said that diluted
Uh,
the culture.
yeah.
What did you mean? What was the culture, and how did it become diluted?
The culture when I joined was, for example, I was told that DEC didn't have salesmen; they had account managers, and the account managers were not on commission; they just paid a good salary to manage the accounts. But by the time you got a bigger company, they changed that, and then they got salesmen and commission, and they weren't necessarily as tied in and responsible for their customers as they were. And when I joined, it was just amazing how friendly people were, how much if you had a problem, you could find someone to help you. And certainly Deck Notes was great for that, because if you weren't sure about something, you'd find a notes conference and you'd post a question, someone would come back to you. You know, like now happens on the internet. We were talking about the 1980s.
What do you think? There's this kind of concept of this debt culture of do the right thing, which you hear a lot of,
Yeah.
and do right by the customer. Was that ever Did you ever do you have a different definition of what that means, and was it ever communicated to you or inculcated in any way?
It was more a general atmosphere, I think, and the fact that the Charlotte package came into engineering, and the engineers in Reading were still liaising with customers, and they were trying to think about what customers wanted, particularly around the upgrade, and being able to manage an upgrade to a system that had been customised. I think they were definitely thinking of doing the right thing for the customers. But central engineering in general weren't thinking that way so much.
What was their thinking, do you think?
Well, they just did what they thought was right. But they were very much in an engineering culture, because what I did with deck forms, I now realise, stepped outside the box. I didn't do what engineers did. I helped launch the product from a technical point of view, and it was very, very successful. But I got no credit within engineering for it, because it wasn't what engineers did.
What is do you have any kind of sense of? I suppose so. That's the interesting focus on the culture there. Do you have the sense that the workplace culture we tackled? Were you actually aware of kind of life outside of DEC? I mean, obviously you're in Reading at this point as well. Were you seeing Reading? Do you have any recollections of Reading at this time as well?
I remember going to some of the offices. No, see, I moved down from Scotland and I moved to Burfield, which is south of the motorway. So by and large, I just commute into Deck Park and out again. I know Jeff Shingles tried to get the junction modified to make it easy to get into Deck Park, and the council wouldn't let him do it. And of course, now they've changed the whole junction.
What was hard about it? Was it just like difficult? Was that creating a traffic jam?
Yeah. Just a traffic jam. Yeah, because there was I don't even know whether it's a 2-lane road that came into Reading, but you basically had to join all the traffic coming off the motorway going into Reading to get into Deck Park. And when I was coming from the south of the motorway, I had to join the people that were coming onto the motorway first, and then I had to cross it on the roundabout. So yeah, no, I used to try and avoid the normal time to come into work, come in early, come in late. But like someone said, I got a computer at home on a phone line, and so I could do some work at home. But it wasn't as fast, and so you couldn't mix with other people, so you still came into the office most of the time.
What was working from home like? I mean, you said you obviously the net. You must have had to get a special line from BT.
Yeah, you had to get a BT phone line and a modem, and you dial in with all the codes. You could hear the codes going across the line, and it was slow. I don't think, I'm not aware of anything special that we did. I will tell you the story when I was in Spitbrook, which must have been 87, 88. The VP of software engineering was a guy called David Stone. And he was telling people, one day, you'll be at home and you'll plug your terminal into the wall and you'll be on the network. And people couldn't believe that would be possible. And of course, we are where we are now. My other story is I was in Spitbrook when it was hacked by German hackers. And one of the guys I knew, only because we chatted at a coffee machine, told me DEC had brought out personal VAX stations. So he'd have quite a powerful computer and a big screen. And he was sat there working, and suddenly he realised his cursor was moving and he wasn't controlling it. And basically a German group had hacked into the network because the only thing I knew before then is that soon there was an announcement we're taking the network down, and they just shut Spitbrook down while they worked out how to stop the hackers coming in.
What, and did you find out who the hackers were? Were they
just a group in Germany? If you look it up on the net, I have done it. They're a well-known hacking group in Germany. They didn't cause any problems in those days. They were just trying to see what they could do. But I remember the guy telling me how weird it was when you're working and suddenly your cursor's moving and you're not doing anything.
And working from home, were you able to do much? What kind of work did you do? Coding from home?
No, just email, really. Just keeping it, email, deck notes, just keeping in touch, really. In those days, I wasn't doing much coding, thinking about, I did the project I did with Dave Shove, the networking thing. Can't remember what we wrote it in, but that was coding. And when I came back to the networking group, I was coding in an Algol type language for OSI. I wrote an XML parser, for what it's worth. No, the network was too slow to do much, but you could keep in touch with email, which helped with the time difference between the UK and the US.
And did you do, so you came in, going back to the beginning, you came in as an all-in-one engineer. That was the job opening. Mm-hmm. Just tell me briefly, what was your step up? What job title did you have? And I suppose the question here, I hear this from other people, were you aware that management was kind of like had your back? Were they kind of like opening up opportunities for you, trying to steer your career advancement in any ways?
Personally, no. In engineering, there was parallel promotion streams, and you could be a manager or you could be an engineer, and you could, at the top levels, there was a level where you could move between the two. And I joined as a principal software engineer, and the next grade up from that would have been consulting software engineer, but I never made that. But no, I was, particularly in the States, there was very little personal guidance because we were developing a product, and so the focus was on developing the product, not on helping the people decide what to do next or anything. What
was management like towards you? I mean, it sounds like you're in a slightly different cultural group with Central in Engineering.
Yeah,
it sounds slightly different to what we're hearing about the rest of DEC.
It is, yeah.
What was their kind of, I don't know...
It was very supportive. I mean, both in DEC Part 2 and in Spitbrook, engineers would be in cubes, but the manager would be in a corner cube, and that would be open, and he'd have a slightly bigger desk. And so you could always walk in and you could see if he was talking to somebody, and if he wasn't, you could have a chat. It was very easy to do that. So it was a very friendly management structure.
And were you ever aware of anything in terms of, I suppose, again, looking outside the central engineering environment? We hear that DEC had a good attitude towards supporting staff in terms of diversity and career advancement, which we just tackled, but also reaching out into the community as well, supporting the local community. Did you ever see any of that?
No, I was too focused on product development, I think. The only the only example I suppose I have is that I was aware in the early 90s that DEC was struggling, and I could feel the culture had changed. And one of the I somehow got connected with the internal communications manager, a guy called Paul Samuels, and through Vogon News I got involved with the VTX product. And so I said to Paul, you could make better use of VTX to internal communications across the company. And he was keen on that. So we actually authored a 6-page paper to describe what it would be. And he pitched it to Jeff Shingles and the management team. But it just sort of never happened because they're focused on other things.
Well, tell me a bit about, so you joined, which remind me, what you joined in which year?
83.
83. And then you left
in 93.
93. So it's 10 years. You've seen a lot of change. You've done a lot of work there for the company, been
Yeah.
heavily involved. What is the factor that causes you to leave the company?
Again, 2 reasons. One is 3 reasons. One is I felt the culture had changed and it wasn't the same company as I joined. And now, how can I describe that? I don't know, but I might come back to it. Second is they were offering redundancy, which they'd started offering redundancy before I took it, and there was another wave coming around, and so I took it. And the third is through Vogon News, I got involved with the video text product, and the engineers were down in Valbonne in the States, but there was a group Valbonne in France. There's a group in the States who were also very involved with VTX, and the manager of that group was trying to take the product out of DEC and make it a standalone product that he could then support and sell to customers. We had ideas about how to improve the product, and I found a colleague who'd already built an add-on to VTX, and so he left DEC and I left DEC, and we set up our own company to build to improve the add-on and make it part of VTX. But unfortunately, before we could release it, DEC said it was stopping VTX because it quite rightly saw the internet coming along, and it was one of the products they wanted to cut, and so it didn't go anywhere. So I left DEC because it wasn't the same company. They were offering redundancy, and I thought an opportunity to start my own company.
Just you mentioned this, just you come back to it. The culture had changed. You mentioned it earlier how the culture changed because it got bigger and the salespeople started getting remunerated as opposed to being customer representatives. How had the culture now changed by the end?
It might be partly a personal thing in that I don't like big organisations, and when I joined DEC, I felt I was joining a relatively small organisation, and because DEC Part 1, DEC Part 2, there weren't that many people there. Okay, must have been hundreds, but there weren't that many people there. I don't know, it just... No, I can't really think of how to describe.
Was it affecting the way you were working? Were things changing the way you were working, or in your team?
Yeah, okay. I mean, on the very personal side, I was struggling with the fact that my contribution to DEC Forms and the launch of it wasn't being recognised. And because of my family, I could either get a green card and stay in the States or come back. So because of the family, I decided to come back. But I was struggling personally over the lack of recognition for what I'd done. Then I joined a group that naturally enough, there's some people that are envious of someone that's been to the States and come back. So I suffered a bit from that. And I wasn't really convinced that OSI was a good thing to do. So I was trying to find a slot I could fit into. And then Vogon News, to some extent, was a lifesaver because it gave me something I could do every day that I knew people appreciated it. And then VTX came along, and it looked like an opportunity. So, yeah, that's a very personal story of it.
And how long did you spend in the States then?
4 years.
You spent 4 years working in the States
Yeah.
on deck
On deck
forms.
forms, yeah, that's all I did.
And where were you living and working? Did you buy property out there? What was the
Yeah, Dan lived in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, which is just by Route 3 and easy to get up to Spitbrook. So, and because I knew him, we rented for a year, then we bought somewhere for the other 3 years.
So it was you and your family out there? And
yeah.
did DEC pay and sort out the whole relocation?
They were very, very good. They were very good. Only thing they didn't do, it was in the conditions for relocation. You could buy a property, sell your property in England and buy a property. With hindsight, they should have advised me not to do that unless I knew I was going to stay. And they didn't advise me to. And my wife didn't like renting. So we bought a property and lost a shed loads of money when we came back to England. But other than that, they gave me a home visit once a year with the family. And I had a home country manager to keep me in touch and give me a job when I came back. They were quite good.
What were the circumstances that took you out there? Did they offer, did a post, because you were working on deck forms, but you had been working on all-in-one.
Yeah, I joined to work on all-in-one, and then Dan was creating a group, and he needed to expand the group. And so he said to his manager, there's this guy in DEC in Reading. I work with him on the standards group. He'd be a good person to come in and join the group. And that's how it happened. So the request came from the States to my manager, and he basically let me go.
And how did it feel? I mean, out there for 4 years with DEC, did you?
I mean, by and large, it was great because DEC once a year, DEC used to take all its employees to Canopy Lake, which is a big resort, a big. It's like Disney World, that kind of resort, and they basically take it over. And as an employee, you can just go there for the day with your kids. I liked Massachusetts, New Hampshire, because it was open. There's more space there. Like they built a new shopping mall in New Hampshire with no sales tax on the border of Massachusetts. So you go there to buy anything that was sizable. But the car park, you had the 2 lines for the car and then a marked gap before the next car for you to open your door, because they had the space, so they could do it. And yeah, you know what car parks are like in England. So no, space was a big thing from there, and and the novelty and the and I always enjoyed basketball, so the Celtics were doing well when I was there.
Did you ever get a chance to fly in the helicopter fleet?
Once.
What was that like?
Oh, amazing. I'd gone to Merrimack, and then I was flying out from Logan for some reason, and I got a seat on the helicopter. Flying across there really showed me how many trees there were, because it's just full of trees. And then the helicopter landed at Logan. Yeah.
Was it just you in the helicopter? Or?
I was obviously the pilot. I don't remember. I don't think it was just me, but it was a small helicopter. There's a pilot. I can't remember whether there's a seat next to him, and then there were 3 seats at the back. There might have been two of us in the seats at the back. But that was, you're smiling as if you might have done it.
I haven't. I've heard lots of people a handful of people who went on the got on the fleet. It was the largest private helicopter fleet in at that time.
Was it? I'm not surprised. Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And did you ever get a chance to meet Ken Olsen or go up to the head office?
No. I went to the mill once, which I thought was an amazing place, absolutely amazing place. And people told you the story about the pole numbering.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, whatever facility you went to in DEC, there were uprights on each floor, and they'd be numbered letters in one direction, numbers in the other direction. So each pole had a letter and a number. So if you were, I can't remember where I was. If I was on ZK2, floor 2, pole number M7, then somebody could find me. And that stemmed from the mill, which is such a amazing mix of floors and offices and that. The guy I went to see had an office on a stairwell. Because the stairs went up, and there's a small little space built off the stairs. It was definitely an open plan office. But yeah, no, I never met Ken. I know somebody who went to the loo at the same time as Ken did once. That's the closest second-hand contact I've got.
So what brought you back from the States eventually?
Is a choice. I either got a green card and stayed, or I came back. I was coming back to Europe. So as you can imagine, I hate Brexit.
Tell me, do you
I
still...
wanted the family kids to grow up in Europe rather than the States. That was the basic thing.
Do you ever stay in touch with Dan? Is Dan still around? He's the
Dan,
guy,
yeah.
He's the guy who's responsible for so much of this, isn't he?
That's right, yeah, for me. But we had a reunion last November, and we went to, the 12 of us, it was organised by the product manager, Bruce Webster, and there were 12 of us went back to Spitbrook, and all 3 buildings are still there. One building is owned by another company, another building isn't used, and then Spitbrook 1 is leased out to lots of small companies. But we were able to find the area that we had cubes in, and it was just open now, but I've actually got a photograph where we positioned everybody roughly where their cube was and took a picture, which was nice. But it was really weird walking the corridors because the machine rooms is empty. They've still got the bars going across where all the cables were, but the machine, there's just no machines there anymore. That was really weird.
How did DEC Park compare to Spitbrook and the
Spitbrook?
How would you kind of describe the spaces or the environments?
DEC Part 1 and DEC Part 2 in Reading are very different. DEC Part 2 was an engineering building modelled on what Spitbrook was. Because Spitbrook was built as to be the central engineering development offices. And then DEC Part 2 was modelled on that. It was a very much a smaller version.
And then the pole numbering system at DEC Park that they had over in the mill as well.
It started in the mill, and then it was used in every DEC building as far as I'm aware. I mean, I don't know if there were any that it wasn't used in, but certainly everywhere I went had pole numbering exactly the same.
So you come on to leave the company for various reasons, which you've given. And then, of course, you're like many people. You saw the news that it was got bought by Compaq and then HPE, or HP as it was back then. What is your feeling at that time when you see that happen?
Sad, really, because I think DEC innovated so much. It was a shame that it got lost. When I started using the World Wide Web, I thought this isn't as good as I was using 10 years ago. 10 years ago it was character cell terminals. But in terms of communication, it wasn't as good.
That being what DEC products on a DEC stack?
As what I could do with DEC, within DEC, for communication. I really like what you guys are doing here, right? And I think communication between people is important, and preserving the heritage is important. But within DEC, I could talk to people in Australia. When I was in Burroughs, I had a conversation over telex with a guy in South Africa who had a question. And I don't know whether you remember telex, but you'd type the question, you'd wait a minute or two, and something would come back, and then you'd think about it, and then you'd type a reply. But within DEC, between phone, mail, and notes, it's just so much interaction. You could share information, you could collaborate easily. Another thing about DEC that I don't know whether anyone said is Ken's philosophy. Ken had a number of philosophies, but he would sometimes task two groups with doing the same thing, particularly hardware development, and then whichever group came up with the best product is the one that would go on. No fault of the other group. It was just he felt it was the best way to have some little competition, was the best way of getting the best product. And someone told me with hardware, one way he would test how robust the hardware was, it is sit on it. He was quite a big guy apparently.
What do you say? So you sadness. You saw the news go down on the acquisition. You felt
Yeah.
sadness. Were you shocked or surprised that it had happened?
I wasn't surprised, because stemming from being in the States and realising that marketing and sales were going towards Microsoft, I could see Microsoft, could see PCs coming along, and I knew that DEC wasn't embracing that particularly well. Okay, they had the rainbow and they did some things, but I didn't feel they were really embracing it well, emotionally, if you like. And so I wasn't too surprised. I was just sad, because I just felt it could have been done better. I was talking to somebody, and I'm sure many people say the same thing. Ken was great in the early days as an engineer, but by the time the 80s came around, he should have handed on to somebody who was more in tune with the way the industry was going. And then I think as a smaller company, it could have stayed around a lot longer.
So what do you think on that note is DEC's legacy to the world? Does it have a legacy? And I suppose what's it left behind? And secondly, what's its lasting impact on you? What have you taken with you into the world, either to other companies or beyond that?
Well, let me come back to the second then. I think a lot of its legacy is hidden, because people have seen what DEC does and they've done it themselves. Networking, it's all very well DEC innovating something, but if you don't carry it through and stick with it, then other people will pick it up. So I think as a networking company, as a electronic communications company, I never really got into the hardware. I know what they did with the Alpha, but I can't really comment on how good that was or anything. But it's just networking and communications. Like when I see things now, I think, oh, I was doing that in the 80s. For me personally, it let me grow and consolidate as an engineer and a presenter. I was crap at presenting until I had to start to present DEC forms, and I realised I knew what I was talking about, and so I would do quite a lot. And it innovated, what they call it now, continuous integration is a buzzword now. We were doing that in DEC forms. We using the DEC products, we would we'd have a code base, and every night it would rebuild the whole product. It would run a test suite against the product. So when you came in the morning, it would tell you if there were any problems. And if somebody submitted something that caused a problem, they had to fix it. And I heard somebody else say, Peter Thompson said, Jeff Shingles said, it's okay making a mistake, but don't make it more than once. But I don't know where I got this from, but I used to say to people, it's okay making a mistake. You can make it a second time, but don't make it a third time. So, but that was the working philosophy that we had. We'd have meetings. What do we call them? We'd have a meeting once a week where anybody who had an idea to add to the product could present it. And then you'd basically talk about it and you'd vote on whether it was a good thing to go into the product or not. So it wasn't Dan that said it, it wasn't me that said it. It was a consensus. And so that was good.
And it's an interesting point, and your legacy, its legacy is this kind of, it shaped you and helped you better at presenting and rounded more rounded engineer.
Yeah, I think it and I think even though some of the experiences were quite hard at the time, I think it made me a better understanding of people and managing people, which I've always tried to stay away. I always tried to stay somewhat hands-on rather than become a pure manager, but I have done small-scale management. Yeah. No, I think I'd have loved to have stayed with DEC as it was when I joined it, if it had evolved in a slower way and focused on what it was good at, rather than try to compete with IBM. Because I can remember there were all these charts being sent around how they were the second biggest computer company. They were nearly as big as IBM. And that just seemed to be the wrong thing to be doing. They weren't focusing on what they were good at.